Right, well, welcome to this evening's talk about people photography. I'm Nigel Hicks, professional photographer living in the southwest of England, and going to talk about now, say, people photography, but not sort of the studio portrait photography that you might think of as being typical people photography. This is very much the sort of people photography that you would see as part of travel and tourism photography, or street photography, or documentary and journalistic kind of photography. So I'm really shooting primarily people as they go about doing whatever it is they do in their life, and just sort of not exactly on the hoof. Some of the shoots, some of the shots I take are set up in some way. Others are spontaneous. And the shot you see here, which is shows actually my partner, PP. Uh, this is probably about as close as you'll ever get, really, with me to sort of formal portraiture in terms of actually sort of homing in on and photographing a particular person, uh, just homing in on their face and photographing them for their own sake. Very often I'm photographing people because of what they're doing, or the kind of work they do, and so on. So really a lot of this photography you're going to see this evening is a sort of more spontaneous kind of stuff taken in the field, photographing people doing what they do. So I'm going to first of all show the first slide, which unfortunately is the usual sort of bullet list of considerations, guidelines, and tips. Sorry, it's a little bit slightly long list, but when I started putting the list together, so more things started popping into my mind about what we should cover. First thing we're going to first comes up is, of course, is what type of photo we're taking. Is actually going to be a portrait about the person, such as the shot you just saw of my partner, or is it going to be something about that person's role, the job, whatever they do in life? In which case, we're going to be, if it's sort of a portrait of the person, then we're going to be really homing in on their face, I suppose. If we're talking about their role, their work, whatever it is they do in their life, then we're going to be sort of perhaps stepping back a little bit and showing them in their environment, doing whatever it is they do. And so once we've made that consideration, then come on to the second point is, well, are these portraits or these reportage shots, are they going to be spontaneous, or are they going to be posed portraits? And very often it doesn't mean, very often you will, or I will anyway, skip between the two. Sometimes it's very spontaneous and reportage, and then sometimes I might ask them to sort of the subject to pose for a shot if they're sort of being a cooperative kind of subject, that is. So so it very much depends on the situation and the kind of person you're photographing, and so on. But really, basically, basic sort of decision is it going to be pose portrait, or is it going to be spontaneous reportage shots? Reportage being sort of photographing them as they go about their business, their work. So you're being basically a fly on the wall, photographing them on the hoof, just shooting what you can get as they go around. And if you're going to then decide what kind of photography you're going to do, whether it's going to be posed or whether it's going to be reportage, then comes the consideration of what kind of lens you're going to use. A telephoto lens will tend to soften features. So if you've got someone with a large nose or a strong jaw, it'll tend to soften and shorten those, especially for photographing straight onto their face. And it will also blur the background. So this is ideal for nice portraits, just really, which is concentrating really on that particular person and their looks. If you want to photograph the work they're doing and the environment they're in, then you're more likely to use a wide angle lens, because that will show their surroundings. It will also tend to exaggerate any sort of sharp angles that there are. So if they've got a large sharp nose or a sharp jaw, a wide angle lens will tend to exaggerate that. So it's not necessarily going to be the most flattering kind of picture you'll get with a wide angle lens, but it will show to the world what they do in their life. So again, it depends on what you're trying to achieve. If you're trying to achieve attractive, flattering portraits, then you will probably want to use a telephoto lens. But if you want to photograph something which tells us a story about their life and about the work they do and so on, then you're more likely to use a wide angle lens so that you can get in their environment and the things that they do. And then, of course, then comes the consideration of what kind of light you're going to have. We're talking about primarily natural light. We'll be shooting mostly in natural light with this kind of thing. So if you have a soft, flat light which goes evenly across the face, then you will have nice, even features. There'll be no deep shadows, there'll be no bright highlights sort of burning out on the skin and or giving dark shadows around the jaw, around the nose, or in the eye sockets. So that's sort of the ideal lighting for a nice flattering portrait, is the soft flat lighting. If you've got backlighting, then of course that is a sort of, say perhaps the sun behind the person, then that will obviously result in a nice even flat light across the face, and it'll also create a halo effect around their hair, especially if they've got blonde hair, as in that photograph I just showed you. But if you have bright, strong sunlight, especially if it's coming in at an angle, that will give you nice, strong, saturated colors, which can be very attractive, but it will also put harsh shadows and highlights across the face. So a nose may well put a strong shadow across one side of the face. Their eyes may be rather sunken and partly lost in the shadows of the eye sockets, or the brows hanging over their face, for example. And you may have a sort of a strong shadow under their jaw and around their neck, which is not so attractive. It's interesting, of course, actually, with if you're photographing women or men, people will often use a different technique. So if you want to photograph a woman, you'll often use a soft flat light to soften their features. With a man, you want to show their manliness and masculinity, in which case you might use a harsher, stronger light to show up the jawline and so on, which makes them look more masculine and tough and so on. Continuing with the lighting, as I said, mostly natural light, but sometimes you might use a flash gun as a bit of a fill-in. You very rarely would use a flash as the primary light in this kind of photography. It's mostly filling in, just balancing against the natural light. The only time you might use flash as the main light is when you're doing studio portraiture, in which case you might be using a much more powerful flash than an ordinary flash gun. But that's the one and only time where you might well use flash as the primary lighting source. If you're using a flash gun as fill-in lighting for your to light up the face, for example, to remove shadows, you would never fire the flash directly at the person. You would either soften it with a diffuser or bounce it off a reflector. You never fire it directly into, always fire indirectly into a face, and never allow red eye to develop. Red eye is when you fire a flash directly at someone's face, and then it bounces back off the retina at the back of their eye, and that shows up red because of the blood in the retina. And so if you fire the flash indirectly, you either diffuse it or you bounce it off a reflector, that will usually overcome the red eye, or prevent red eye happening, because the light will be entering their eye at an angle and won't be coming straight back at you. If you do end up with red eye, then these days, of course, there are a number of sort of software solutions which will help you remove that red eye in the computer afterwards. And when you're photographing a portrait, you always focus on the eyes. That's because that's just the way we are psychologically. When we look at a face, whether it be a human or an animal, we'll always go to the eyes. And if the eyes are not right, if they look blurred or whatever, then the picture won't look quite right. So even if you're photographing both the person's face and the work they're doing, and the work perhaps maybe they're a potter or some kind of craftsman, their work may be in a different plane from the face. It may be closer to the camera than the face. You may be tempted to focus on the work they're doing rather than on the face. But then you end up with the face being a little bit blurred. But actually, you should always focus on the face and just leave the work to go as it is. And hopefully, if you've got a reasonable depth of field, then you'll get the work sharp as well as the face. Then there's the question of, should the subject be looking at the camera, so you have an interaction between the photographer or someone looking at your pictures and the person being photographed, or should that person be concentrating on what they're doing, for example, if you're photographing the work they're doing? And that's something that you can mix and match. Sometimes well, very often actually, if I'm photographing someone doing a piece of work, I'll tell them to just ignore me and just carry on doing whatever they're doing. And but I will usually say that, but if I find that you're in a great pose, and I just happen to be in a great pose, I want you to hold it for a few seconds, then I'll ask them to hold it and just perhaps look up at the camera as well, for reasons that will come a little bit more obvious a little bit later when I show you some of the photos. And then penultimate points, set the camera at the appropriate height, whether that should be above your subject, below your subject, or level with the subject. It's really hard to say what that appropriate height is. It depends on the kind of atmosphere you're trying to get. Of course, if you've got the camera a little bit below the subject, then that subject tends to look rather larger and more dominating, and I suppose perhaps manly at times. If you've got the camera above above the person, then you'd rather make them a little bit more diminutive and so on. So that may affect sort of the kind of general mood of the picture, but I think it kind of comes a little bit naturally while you're when you're doing it, and also to some extent it may be determined by how much space you have around you. I find that quite often if I'm photographing indoors, especially, very often where I put the camera is not so much determined by what I would like, but actually how much space I can get the camera into next to that person. And then finally, quite an important one, all these points are important, but this is a one that people often overlook, is ensure that your subject is relaxed in front of the camera. If someone is tense or nervous, it will really show up in the final photos and rather spoil the picture. And it's kind of a problem if you're just with travel and tourism photography, if you just show up at a place and just or if you just start snapping away at people without bothering to ask permission, then you may well get them in a relaxed pose. But if you ask permission, then they'll often freeze and they might well give permission, but they'll freeze and be rather unnatural in front of the camera, and that can be a little bit problematic. I'm not very good at this, but there are plenty of photographers I know who spend a long time talking to their subjects before they even get the camera out of the bag, let alone press the shutter. I'm usually a little bit too impatient, or my time frame is a bit too short and don't have time to spend enough time talking to people. Or of course, if you're in another country where they don't speak English terribly well and I don't speak the local language brilliantly, then or even at all sometimes, then it can be a little bit tricky talking to people and trying to relax them in front of the camera. But it's always worth trying to do it if you possibly can to get your subject to relax. Sometimes, of course, you have a subject who's just naturally relaxed, and that's just fantastic. You can just shoot away and get your pictures quite happily. Anyways, let's look at some nice pictures, hopefully nice pictures anyway. So going back to my beautiful partner, Pipi again, slightly different shot this time, but the same kind of idea. A posed portrait. This is, say, about as close as you'll ever get with me to posed portrait photography, but using natural sunlight with the sun coming from behind her, sort of basically top right, coming onto the left-hand side of her face and lighting up the hair. So you've got a little bit of a halo there, but because the sun's coming from behind, then you've got a nice, soft, flat, even lighting across the face, so there's no hard shadows, and it's all quite nicely, evenly lit. Obviously, if the sun is coming from behind and the face is somewhat in shadow, so you may have a tendency for the face to be a bit dark because the camera's light meter might be wanting to expose for the background, which is obviously quite strongly sunlit. That you can overcome, hopefully, either by bouncing the sunlight back into their face using a reflector, or perhaps by using a little bit of a fill-in flash, or perhaps by overexposing the picture slightly. That's often works quite well. The only danger there is that blonde hair you've got there in the halo can then start to burn out, and that can spoil the picture a little bit. Or finally, the other solution, which I think I used here to some extent, is to actually lighten the face a little bit in the computer afterwards if it is a bit too dark. But that's quite variable, and you just sort of see how things go when you start shooting. But it's quite handy to have a white reflector in your bag to actually throw the light back into someone's face if you're kind of photographing in this kind of composition. At the other extreme, we have a shot. It's not exactly a wide angle shot, but it's nevertheless a shot taken side on to the face and in very strong side lighting. And you can see now we have sort of bright, brilliant highlight on the forehead and deep shadows under the jaw and around the neck. And it kind of breaks up the face a little bit, but it doesn't. It's still, I think, I quite like the shot. It's very strong, shows the man's face very strongly. This actually is a Maasai chief in Kenya, and I wanted to photograph him as part of a deal. He and I struck about photographing his village, and I wanted really to get him to stand under a tree so I could get him in the shade and have nice flat even lighting over his face, but he didn't speak English, or at least he claimed he didn't, and I certainly didn't speak any Maasai or Swahili, so communication was a little bit tricky. But anyway, we struck a deal through a translator who wasn't actually there at this moment to actually guide the photography instructions, but we ended up with this portrait, which is really quite a strong portrait, but it does struggle, I think, from having the highlights on the forehead here, and I think the shadow down around the neck is perhaps a bit too strong. On the jaw, not too bad. It really shows up at the shape of his face quite nicely in that sense. Same kind of situation, they're much more spontaneous. Obviously, the last shot or the last two shots were highly set up for different reasons. This one's quite spontaneous, taken in the Philippines. Filipinos just love to be photographed, and this fella just wandered along past me one day and then just stopped and posed and wanted to be photographed. So that's what I've got, and it's a nice sunlit day, obviously, but of course his face is a little bit lost in shadow under his cap. I still quite like this shot, partly because of the fish, actually, I have to say. But the sunlight it gives us really nice, strong, saturated colours, and it's a very atmospheric and happy kind of picture. I just wish I could see his face a little bit better. I could have asked him to remove his hat, but I've found in the past that it doesn't really work terribly well, because when people are wearing a hat for quite a long time, of course, when they take the hat off, their hair is often all over the place and their forehead can be quite sweaty, so it doesn't look great. Sometimes it's better just to leave the hat in place and live with the sort of shadow that we have here. Taken with a wide angle lens, so everything is sharp. It's got a big depth of field right the way towards the horizon there. Closer to home in South Devon, a thatcher at work, same kind of thing, wide angle lens, strong saturated colors in the sunlight, and a hat partially hiding the face. A little bit tricky, but in this instance, I think the work is actually more important than the portrait of the man at work, actually. So obviously I'm trying to capture him doing the thatching rather than get a portrait of him per se. But I think it works reasonably well. It is a shame to have the shadow across half his face like that, but nevertheless, the picture as a whole, I think, works quite well. And also the low angle gives us a view up the roof and shows him working quite well. Another spontaneous shot again in the Philippines. Again, the situation where you have people that just demand to be photographed. I was actually out just trying to photograph the beach for a magazine and other publications, and these two little girls playing on the beach actually really literally demanded that I photograph them. So that was quite a nice thing to go and do. Again, strong sunlight, strong saturated colors, which give us quite a nice atmosphere, but strong shadows across the face, around the eyes and so on, and in the jaw. Hasn't really spoiled the picture as such, because the atmosphere, the personality shining out of their faces is so strong, and I think it carries the picture and makes it a very happy, ebullient, vibrant, joyful sort of shot, which is helped by the strong sunlight, in fact. So we move on there from strong sunlight pictures through to those taken wholly in the shade or partly in the shade or in cloudy weather or whatever, to a picture of a group of boys in Borneo. This is actually taken in an Iban longhouse in the forests in Borneo, and obviously some big white guy toting cameras is a matter of interest to people who don't actually see very much happen from day to day. So I got a little bit of an audience from the kids at least, and they happened to make quite a nice little composition in this window, sort of framed by the window to some extent, and a nice soft even light going across them, being in the shade. So we can see all their details, all their features. I think you could argue that I perhaps should have tilted the camera upwards a little bit more to have a little bit less t-shirt at the bottom, and a little bit more of the heads of the top two boys. But apart from that, I think I find it a nice, fun, attractive sort of shot. And then another shot, which actually again was spontaneous, and the little boy didn't exactly demand to be photographed, but he came up right behind me with his little toy gun, and when I pointed the camera at him, he didn't run away screaming or howling or anything. He just stood and posed. And this is the shot we got taken on quite a cloudy day, so the light is nice and soft. Portrait photography really is well done on cloudy days. It's a really nice light for this kind of work, especially if it's a little bit bright cloudy, dark cloudy perhaps less so, but nice flat even lighting across the sky. It gives you nice portraits where you really don't have deep shadows. But this one is shot, it's again nice even face, slightly cheeky little boy with his bubble gum and his toy gun, and I've always liked this picture for that reason. So those have been mostly shots of people sort of closely interacting with me and looking at the camera, or at least participating in the photography in some way. Now, the next few pictures, we look at people who are at work doing what they do, and so I've basically have told them to ignore me. These are usually situations where either I've turned up with a translator or a guide, and we've asked sort of whoever's running the place for permission to take some pictures, and then we've just moved in on one or two people who are working in a in a suitable sort of position with good lighting, good natural lighting, and where there's also space for me to get in close to them, and who clearly is not intimidated by me being there with the camera. So this is a typical sort of shot when you do that. There is a little bit of fill-in flash on this picture, just to brighten up the fluorescent tubes, the lighting, so it's pretty horrible, and putting some unpleasant shadows across this worker's face. But with a little bit of fill-in flash, managed to put some even lighting across her face, and also a little bit of lighting on her arms as well, so on the right arm as well. The trick with fill-in flash is to make it look like there hasn't been any flash, when in fact I know there has been. You've got a little bit of a highlight there, but it really is just to sort of take out the shadows and just bring up the light level a little bit. Also, it can be useful with a little bit of fill-in flash if you're shooting handheld in poor lighting. Having the fill-in flash enables you to get away with a slightly slower shutter speed than would be possible if you didn't have that flash. So, because with the flash gun firing at a thousandth of a second, then you can have a rather slower shutter speed, and any camera shake won't show up. So that's always a useful tip and a useful reason to use fill-in flash if necessary. Another kind of thing is a potter at work in Japan. This was quite a tricky shot because his pottery workshop was so tiny. I actually had a lot of trouble getting far enough away from him. I was pressed up against the side wall of his little workroom there, trying to get enough space to get his pot and him in the picture. And you can see there's also some light coming in from the right there. That was his own work light. It's an ambient light. It's not flash at all. And you see with this shot, and also with the last one of the problems you have with photographing people while they're working is that they're nearly always looking down. So it can be quite tricky to get a shot where you've got their eyes visible and in focus as well. It can be difficult to actually get the camera to focus on when they're looking down. In this shot, he's looking down, but also sideways, slightly, so slightly looking towards the camera. So that in this instance, it worked reasonably well. I think there were other shots in this sequence where he was looking down from the other way, in which case, had I shot, I would have been kind of looking at the back of his head a bit, which would not have been great. But I've always liked this picture. I've had it for quite a while, but I always like to show this picture. I find it very attractive. The light is not fantastic, but it works reasonably well, and it's sharp, not just on his face, but also on the pot as well. You can see that on his leg, the focus is going out, and so it shows that it's quite a narrow depth of field. His leg is blurred and the background is blurred, so we've got this focus nicely on his face and on the pot as well. Now we come to something where actually I photographed this shot for not so much for the person, in fact, not for the person at all, really, but for the weaving. There's a particular type of weaving. This is very much a cultural photograph here. The person is secondary to what's going on here, because this kind of the weaving loom she's using is called a backstrap loom, where the tension in the loom is maintained purely by the strap that goes around the weaver's back. Is a particularly back-breaking kind of weaving, and you don't see it in very many places. The only places I've ever seen it is in the far south of the Philippines, which is where this is photographed, and in nearby Borneo as well. So quite a regional area for where this kind of work is concentrated. Anyway, so she's working outdoors, but under a balcony, on a veranda. So she's in the shade. So I'm shooting just with natural light that's coming in under the veranda, and without any flash or without any sunlight coming in as well. So nice, soft, even lighting. I think that her face is not completely sharp. She's probably moving quite a bit, as you can see in her hand. There's quite a bit of blur there, so she's moving quite rapidly in this shot. The shutter speed actually is only a 60th of a second, so I wouldn't be at all surprised if there was some blur there. Clearly, with the hand, that would be normal. A little bit of blur in the face, which is not ideal, and also because I am a little bit above her, and she's looking down, so the eye is not particularly clear, which is a little bit of a drawback. But as I say, I was photographing this more for the weaving than for the person, actually. Ken coming back much closer to home to an agricultural show in East Devon, and I took this again not so much as a portrait of the person, but for the atmosphere. This really rather tender moment between her and her bull. It's not the sort of thing you kind of normally expect from breeders or farmers, but a very tender sort of affection for her prize bull at this show, and obviously can't see the eyes at all because of the sunglasses. So a bit of a reportage documentary shot rather than really a portrait. It was spontaneous in the sense that I just wandered up. She was very happy to be photographed in this sort of situation. Well, sometimes I don't ask permission, but when I'm coming this close to somebody, then usually I do. And I did actually talk to her for some time, taking a number of pictures of her about the farming and about the bull and so on. So that was quite a nice little conversation we had, which did get her very relaxed and very amenable to being photographed with her prize animal. Also in the UK, this is in Somerset, a willow weaver. There are a few places in Somerset still growing willows and weaving the willows as part of their business as well. And in fact, it's making a bit of a comeback, which is rather nice. So this is actually indoors in really quite awful light, photographically speaking, awful light. Anyway, there's enough light for them to work by, but not great light for the photography. The ambient lighting was always in the wrong place, putting their faces partly in shade or in shadow, I should say. So this is taken with some fill-in flash. It is actually also a very high ISO, 1000 ISO, and the shutter speed is 100th of a second. So I'm pretty sure I was hand holding, so I used 100th of a second to make sure I had no motion, no blur on no camera shake there. And so a bit of fill-in flash there to make sure his face is lit up, because I know that the ambient light coming from the ceiling was coming in from the wrong angle and putting the right-hand side of his face in shadow. It didn't look great at all. So with the flash, we got it lit up quite nicely. You can see there's a few highlights here which give it away that there was a little bit of flash, but nothing really very strong. It's actually quite well balanced against the ambient light that's coming across the rest of his face. A telephoto lens. Not sure how long, probably about 100, 150, I suppose, to come in close on his face and on the work, and from a low angle, shooting from a low angle as well, so that I can have both the basket work rather and his face close together, rather than with wide separation. Here, I've managed to get them quite close together, so they're at the same level in the frame. And also, he's obviously clearly looking very intently at his weaving, but having a low level and managing to get his eyes quite clearly visible and sharp in the picture. Here's a sort of shot where you really do struggle with someone looking down. Most of the time, here's a guitar maker in the Philippines. They make there's an area or part of a city in Cebu in the central south of the Philippines where they make most fantastic handmade acoustic guitars. So if anybody's in the market looking for an acoustic guitar, Cebu is the place to go to get them. Anyway, so this is in one of the guitar factories there, and taken with just ambient light again. Actually, no, there is a bit of there is a bit of fill-in flash there, and I think you can probably see that on the forehead here and around the creases in his skin on his face. There's a little bit of flash lighting up the face there. So ambient light levels probably not that great, and I wanted to make sure I didn't get any camera shake as well. So it's 20th of a second I'm shooting this. So I'm probably on a tripod if the shutter speed is that slow. And always here, of course, he's looking down along the line of his guitar to make sure it's all straight and lined up nicely. But even when he wasn't doing that, he was looking down all the time. So a little bit problematic trying to get shots of guitar makers that are not looking down. So if you've got a cooperative boss who will actually help you along, then you have this kind of thing where the guy is actually posing for you and looking up. I do like this shot because I love the guitars in the picture. Unfortunately, his face is a bit blurred. It's actually a very slow shutter speed. It's only an 1/8 of a second. There is a bit of fill-in flash on it, as I think you can see on his face and in his eye here. Both eyes actually, there's a little bit of light there, so there is fill-in flash. And I think the slow shutter speed is probably not quite worked because he's probably moved his head ever so slightly during the exposure, which is a bit of a shame. Because apart from that, the picture I think is great. It has been used a few times in magazines and so on. So it does tell the great thing about this story that despite the blur in the face, it does really help to tell the story of the guitar makers in Cebu, and just the quality and the beauty of the guitars they produce. So 1/8 of a second, the camera must have been on a tripod and using a 32mm lens set at 32mm, so it's a little bit wide. So I've got not just him in, but also one of the guitars hanging on the side there as a prop. So then coming back to the UK and to Cornwall and the grape harvest. This one, again, is a situation of actually setting up in advance with the vineyards manager and being allowed to come in and just photograph some of the workers spontaneously. So set up in advance, but then just spontaneously picking on one or two of the workers who were picking the grapes. This shot is posed because she was working so fast that each time I tried to photograph her picking a bunch of grapes, by the time the camera would focus and I'd half press the shutter button, she would have had those grapes off the vine and in the basket. So I had to ask her to stop for a few seconds and hold that position so we could get a shot of her with the grapes still on the vine. No flash, just natural ambient light taken on a cloudy day. I've deliberately sort of just really had her on the edge of the picture because it is more about her work than about her, but it's quite nice to have her sort of obviously well into the shot as well. And then another shot which is really, really set up, again taken in Borneo, a Penan tribesman who are one of the groups of tribes that lives in what's left of the rainforest in Borneo. Not surprisingly, the Penan tribesmen don't dress like this in their daily life anymore. They wear shorts and t-shirts like everybody else. But this was, he was a dancer at some show, and it was set up for him to come and have some photos with me after the show, set up by the local tourist board. So you don't want to upset the tourist people. You want to get a nice shot to get some nice pictures lined up. I'm obviously higher up than him, and with the blowpipe being pointed more or less towards me, so we got the bird's eye view really of the business end of a blowpipe, and also the sort of what we might hope would be the idealized lifestyle of a Penan tribesman in the rainforest. Of course, not so anymore. But again, well, being Borneo, there's no sunlight; it's just cloudy and an awful lot of green vegetation all around as well. So relatively soft, flat light, deep shadows in around his body, but reasonable lighting on his face. He's a little bit shadowy on his right hand side, but good light on his left as well. So a picture that works reasonably well. Something a little bit similar, but in a very different place. This is in the rainforest in the Philippines, and this is quite an anthropological kind of picture, really, because this shows an Essa tribesman who are basically the sort of the Aborigines of the Philippines, the people that have lived in the Philippines since long before today's Filipinos arrived, and they still live in the rainforest in very simple villages, eking a sort of a slash and burn subsistence living in the forest. And this was one of the village chiefs that I visited one day. I was with a ranger from a national park, and we came to see him to talk about the fact that they'd been cutting down some forest in the wrong place and shouldn't have been cutting forest where they had, and so there was a bit of trouble. But nevertheless, despite the trouble, the village chief was quite happy to have me photograph him. It's, I say, in the hut, but the side of the hut is completely open, and that's behind me. So I've got natural light coming in from behind me to light up his face. So we've got relatively soft, flat, even light shining on his face. Few highlights, but nothing too severe. And then looking on into the inside of the hut behind him. So quite a simple shot in terms of the overall appearance. A little bit tricky in terms of its execution because the light was not that easy, and because the light level behind him was very, very low. But not too bad in the end. It's ISO 640 and a 40th of a second shutter speed, so handheld, and just concentrating on him and also showing his environment behind him, and obviously presumably a member of the family as well. And this is really him in his day-to-day life, his day-to-day gear, not in anything prepared for any kind of photography. He wasn't set up for the photography. He had no idea I was coming until I was there. Anyway, so moving on, also in the Philippines, not an anthropological story, but a conservation story. And this, like most of my photography, really is quite a simple shot. Don't really do anything terribly clever, just line them up with, hopefully with the best kind of light and a reasonable composition. In this situation, what we're showing here is a fellow called Bernard. He works for an organization called the Mabuhay Foundation, which is a non-government organization in the Philippines charged with trying to save the Philippine crocodile from extinction, which is probably the world's most endangered crocodile. And here we are. They go breeding Philippine crocodiles in captivity, and when they get to 2 years old, at which point they're large enough to fight off attackers, they're released into the wild inside one of the national parks in the north of the country. And so this is what's happening here. It's a very simple shot. It's got a lot of sunshine coming down and very high sunshine, so it's really quite awkward lighting. The crocodile is in sunlight, the background vegetation is in sunlight. His face is in shadow because of the light, and because of his hat, I should say. And in this instance, the hat is actually kind of saved the day because it has, although it's put an very even shadow across his whole face. I don't have half shadows or deep shadows. It's quite a nice, soft, even lighting across his face, which has worked reasonably, really quite well. And although it's therefore quite a strong contrast between the shadow of his face and the bright sunlight on the crocodile, it nevertheless has worked reasonably well and given us quite a good exposure, and a picture that again really tells the story, which is the critical point of this picture. The crocodile was released into a lake just a few minutes after the shot. You can see he's got a radio tracker on his pelvis, so he can follow his movements afterwards. And needless to say, the tape which is around his snout to stop him taking a chunk out of Bernard's hand is removed before he gets put in the water. The crocodile, by the way, was named Nigel in my honour, because they give all the crocodiles they release a name. And since I was there that day, they called him Nigel. And so there was a crocodile in the Philippines named after me, hopefully still there. Anyway, so moving on and come to a shot which taken in Peru, which shows the problems that you get when your subject looks rather nervous. I've always really liked this picture in terms of its subject and its composition and so on, and the lighting on it as well, but just never got to use it because he just looked really quite tense and nervous. This is taken in a village where they are renowned for making by hand these hats out of a grass fiber. Lovely looking hats. And I was with a translator who stopped and asked this man if we could take a couple of pictures, and he agreed, of course. But the moment he did, he just froze. He'd been absolutely fine until that moment, and then he just froze and became completely unnatural. And this is the problem you often have. Sometimes it's better just to go up to somebody and take a few quick shots rather than actually ask. But obviously, when you're coming in this close to somebody, you do tend to have to ask really rather than just snap away, although sometimes I do anyway. So this is sort of nice flat lighting. It shows his environment behind him of his home with the hats for sale, but it is, I think, rather spoiled by the fact that he does look so nervous. This shot is always, I use this as an illustration of how important it is to get someone to relax before you take too many pictures or even any pictures. So then, no problem with this fellow relaxing, and that's because he probably doesn't know he's being photographed at an agricultural show. Actually, it's at the Devon County show, and just taken with quite a long telephoto lens, a 200mm lens. There's not that long, but with it being such a crowded, busy scene, and he's busy working, he's not really paying attention to me. And so I've got a shot of him really nicely relaxed with a nice smile on his face. Compositionally, you might say it's a little unconventional, with him being way over on the right-hand side and looking to the right and looking out of the frame. Technically, strictly speaking, I should have had him over to the other side of the picture and looking into the frame. But I think this composition actually works because of that, because it does disrupt the usual ideas on how composition should be. I think it works quite nicely. Again, although it was a sunny day, mostly sunny, here we have nice soft flat light across his face, so no strong shadows or no breaking up his jaw or highlights on his face or anything like that. So it works quite nicely. And also because it's a longish telephoto lens, all the background is completely blurred, so he's really popping out of the background quite nicely. Similar kind of agricultural event, but rather very different location, rather different scene. Down in Patagonia, in Chile, Gaucho's really hard at it, showing off really, not really working, just having a bit of a competition and showing off. So fast action kind of portrait photography, 400th per second on the shutter. It's a 103mm lens, so not that strong a telephoto. I'm quite close to them, but they're moving pretty darn fast, and I had to take quite a few shots to get a few that were sharp. and just trying to capture the action and the men as they really went about it, trying to round up these horses. They were actually pretty hopeless at what they were doing, but it made for some good photography and also great spectacle as well of this happening. So another agricultural show shot in the photograph in the UK. This one, as you can see, taken with a wide angle lens and from a low angle, sort of kind of shot that I just situation really where I just did not ask permission, just go in and grab a few quick shots, which is why the man on the phone is, and the boys are looking at me rather quizzically, and if I perhaps I'm a little bit mad, but that's okay because this is a documentary reportage shot, just trying to grab the scene spontaneously, just record what's happening, and not really wanting to have anything posed. I don't want people posing and posturing in this kind of shot. I just want to really grab the moment as it is. And from the point of view of composition, using the wide angle lens and the low angle, what I've got is a strong triangle going across the picture, which really, for me, creates a nice sort of dynamic, energetic atmosphere. The fellow at the end here in the suits kind of mucks it up a little bit, but he's fairly small in the scene, and just wanted to get this little group of sheep and people together and just involved in whatever they're doing in the agricultural show. The final few pictures show really just sort of what you might say specialized kind of portrait shots of specialized technique, you might say, sort of thing you might not do all the time. And that really is, in this instance, blurred motion, where we've got a slow shutter speed. It's a 13th of a second, got a little bit of fill-in flash, which you can perhaps see on the side of the face, because this was actually in a very poor lighting situation. The flash is still not the dominant lighting source, it's still ambient light coming down from above, but the fill-in flash put in a little bit of lighting on the side and also helped to freeze the movement a little bit, both his movement and actually mine as well, because it's a very cramped space, so I had to handhold. And it's a moment of very fast movement where this brewer emptying some malted barley into a hopper, so it's quite a fast movement. Only lasted a few seconds. Only managed to get the one shot, and this is it. A little bit of, well, quite a bit of blur in the sack and in the malted barley as it pours out of the sack. Bit of blur in his arm, which really gives a sense of movement and dynamism, which I quite like. But the face is primarily sharp. His hair is a bit blurred actually, but his face is sharp, so you really got that to home in on. And I find this works quite well. Another kind of people, can't really call it portraiture, but people photography, which you might do from time to time, is silhouettes. Silhouettes often work quite well when you've got a good silhouette, of course. And in this instance, it's a windsurfer preparing to launch his board, and completely backlit by a fairly low sun. So a strong silhouette when they work really very well. And that's this kind of silhouette that I rather like in this kind of situation. It's a very fast shutter speed, actually 640th of a second, and it's f/22, so we've got the lens aperture closed right down, and very fast shutter speed. And that's the reason for that is because we've got so much light bouncing off the water that was going to burn out massively and also spoil the silhouette a little bit. So I had to really massively underexpose the shot in order to be able to get that black silhouette and without the water burning out too much. Next shot shows something again where, although it's people photography to an extent, is where the person is actually again very secondary. I mean, I've showed you a couple of shots already where the person has been reasonably secondary to the what else is going on in the picture, but here they're completely secondary, where we just have a little girl holding up a flying fish for me to see. This for sale in a little market by the beach in the south of the Philippines, and yeah, anybody who's been in the tropics and has seen flying fish will know that they can be pretty common, and you don't get to see them very much. You only get to see them for a few seconds. They buzz past you a foot or two from your ear as they leap perhaps over the boat or leap through the water just close to the boat. So you don't get to see the detail very much. So it's nice to see them on the shore. Sadly, caught actually for dinner, of course. So that's not so nice. But you see up the detail in their huge fins, which of course is what they use for flying. And then just the girl in the background nicely blurred out, so she doesn't compete too much for attention with the fish. I have framed it deliberately so her eyes are visible, so we could definitely have a nice sort of shot of the girl. So the fish is fairly low in the picture, but it's done deliberately to include the girl's eyes. Now, finally, just this last shot, just to really show up the nice, beautiful, bright colors and what you can get when someone really sort of helps you out and cooperates with you. This is a woman in a market in really far south of the Philippines who just took me under her wing. I was just wandering around this textiles market trying to get some shots, and she just took me under her wing and just guided me around and really helped me out, and enabled an awful lot of really great pictures to be taken. She did, of course, expect me to buy a few things at the end of it all, which I did, duly did, and so we were all happy at the end of it all. Compositionally, not entirely the most fantastic picture. I'm obviously a good bit higher up than her, which perhaps is not ideal, but I wanted to do that in order to show off all these textiles to their best. And she's perhaps a little bit smaller in the frame than maybe I should have framed, but I did that again primarily because I wanted to surround her with all the textiles, which really give this wonderful, colourful scene and make her a colourful person, which she was actually anyway, without all this. Anyway, so that really is the end of the talk. That just sort of summarizes some of the sort of people photography that I do and the techniques that I use and the ideas I try to put over in the shots. There's just final picture, not quite the same as you, not hitting you with all the books. Just want to sort of tell you again about the new Aquaterra publishing website, which is now a sort of online bookshop and print shop, which is now live and taking orders, hopefully, and hopefully working well as well. And you get 10% off everything at the moment with this discount coupon ATP Summer 2021. And obviously the usual thing with the nigelhicks.com website, all the photo galleries and the autumn courses coming up. If you want to book anything, the program of autumn courses is there. And then you can watch the past talks and register for the future talks. The next talk is on the 28th of July, and that's going to be about blurred motion photography. So blurring the movements of car lights, blurring moving water, blurring people in action and so on. So how to use the blur effectively to create the sense of dynamism and movement, and also create patterns and just artistic effects. That's what will happen on the 28th of July at 8 p.m. So I'm going to unshare my screen now, and anybody who wants to ask any questions, please do so. Obviously, turn your microphone on if you want to do that, and just talk. Yeah, I'll just unshare the screen. So, okay, just if anybody has any questions, please let me know. I have one chat here. Someone asking, that was Shane, wonder how this would look in black and white. I'm not sure which picture you're referring to. Shane, do you want to turn your microphone on and elaborate?
Yeah, it was the hi, by the way.
Oh, hi.
It was the Peruvian gentleman that was in the blue check shirt, and okay. I love the colours in that. And whilst you were unsure about his facial expression, actually I really liked it. So I think a lot of it's the eye of the beholder anyway, isn't it?
That's very true. Yeah. No, I love the colours and I lovely blue. I think with the white hats, I think it's fantastic. I'm just a little nervous about I'm nervous about his nervousness.
Yeah. And I love the colours too, but I also wondered if that was a shot that might actually be even enhanced differently by being in black and white.
Well, it'd be an interesting experiment. Of course, it's not going to not going to change his nervous expression, no. But it might it'd be an interesting experiment to see how well a black and white shot there would compare with the color shots. Because sometimes just removing the color can sort of simplify a picture and make it more impactful in that sense. But especially if you've got a picture where there's just too many colors. I know that shot doesn't have a huge color palette, so it's not so bad. But if you've got a shot with just too many blinding colors, then simplifying it can help.
Absolutely. Thank you.
You're welcome. Anybody else? Anybody got any questions? Mark, you usually have a question for me.
It's an obvious one, which is, you know, tripod or not tripod. I guess it depends on whether you want to make it, you know, spontaneous or not, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a tricky one, and I actually, even after all these years, I still struggle with it because obviously, if you use the tripod, then you're a little more constrained. You can't change your position so quickly, and you can be a little bit stuck with a tripod. And also, time and again, if I'm photographing people at work indoors, say that the weavers I showed you, there's often not a lot of space around them, and there's wooden frames and clutter and everything, and it can be quite difficult to find somewhere to put the tripod legs, and so the composition then can become constrained by where you can put the tripod legs rather than what is actually the best composition, which so very often even in situations where I've started off using the tripod, I've ended up abandoning it and saying, well, I've got to be able to get into a better position than this. And so it is a difficult one, and I think you just basically, with each situation, have to suck it and see which is the best option for you.
Yeah, I guess, but thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Nigel, is there a sort of a definitive length of lens for portraiture, do you think?
Well, again, it depends on the kind of portrait you're doing. If you're doing sort of the shots where you're doing a nice flattering photo, such as I showed you at the beginning of Pipi, my partner, then you're looking really at 100 or 200 millimeters. In fact, the very first shot I showed you at the very beginning with the title on was taken with a 300mm lens, just to really home in on her face and make sure the background was absolutely completely blurred. So it's hard to generalize. Obviously, if you're doing the kind of shots I showed you through most of the show of people at work where I've used a relatively wide angle view, then it's really hard to generalize. You're changing it all the time depending on how well you can fit their work in along with their face. But again, if it's a sort of just a flattering portrait where you're homing in just on the face, and you're looking at maybe 100 to 200 millimeter most of the time.
Do you have a go-to lens for people photography in your kit? Do you have one? I can't be without this one.
Well, I have my workhorse lenses are 3 lenses: the 17 to 40, 24 to 105, and 70 to 200. And any or all 3 of those can be called upon in any sort of people photography scenario. If I'm doing, again, the sort of the close-up portrait shot where I want to blur the background and I'm homing in just on someone's face and they're looking at me, then I will tend to use the 70 to 200mm lens. Sometimes the 24 to 105 set at its maximum focal length, but usually the 70 to 200. But if I'm shooting someone doing working and trying to get their work in as well as their face, and it will usually be the 24 to 105 set out at 24 or 30 or 35 millimeter. Occasionally, if space is tight and I'm sort of really cramped up quite close to them, then I'll actually use the 17 to 40mm lens just to try and open the space up a little bit. So yeah, so 3 lenses are the go-to lenses, really, depending on the situation.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, anybody else? No? Okay, if nobody's got any more questions, then I'm going to close the session this evening and say thank you very much for your time. I'm glad you enjoyed, or glad you joined me. I hope you enjoyed it. And I'll look forward to seeing you again in July. What was it, 28th of July for Blurred Motion Photography. And in the meantime, I hope you enjoy the summer and ever greater freedom and good weather. So talk to you again soon. Thanks.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you,
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Nigel.
Bye.
Cheers.
Right.
Thank you, Nigel.
Right. Bye.